I wanted to invite Jess to just chat with you guys because he's at Red Rocks Church. Red Rocks Worship. You guys probably heard of them. And when you listen to the mixes online, it's amazing. If you go to an in-person service at a Red Rocks campus here, it's amazing. So I thought who better to share some wisdom in the broadcast audio realm than this dude. So go ahead and take it away. And
thank you, Jake.
Have fun. Yeah.
Hey, how you guys doing?
Good.
Tummies are all full. Hopefully our brains aren't too full yet. If so, I will have your cup runneth over. So I'm Jesse. Like Jake was saying, I kind of head the audio team and teams at Red Rocks Church at the campus level and more central and broadcast level. So my week, I guess to kind of fill you in what that actually means, my week at Red Rocks, we do our broadcast service on Thursdays, usually, where we're capturing the whole thing, both camera, lights. We do have people in the room, but it's very known to the people in the room that, hey, we might mess up on a song, so we might redo a couple parts. It's not like a Sunday service where it's like, what happens is what happens. So then we do that on Thursdays. That's where I'm doing the mixing up in the broadcast booth, or the broadcast room, rather, audio room. I take all the individual channels that Adam was talking about. By the way, let's give it up for Adam. He did an amazing job this morning. Such a good speaker. I learned a lot from it. Hopefully you guys did too. So I take all those individual tracks, I mix it down to stereo or left-right, and that's what you hear online that's embedded with the video. And then Sunday, then we kind of spread out to the campus level. So we have multiple locations. At the campus level at Red Rocks, everything's live except for the message, the speaking, which was done on Thursday. So we use Resi, who is out in the hall and grace us with their presence, to handle and manage all that streaming and uploading and downloading to make that happen, both for online, all of our handles, as well as multi-site. So that's what we do live. And then, so it allows our team to separate them like that. It allows our team to kind of focus on online on Thursday and then focus on the campus level. So we're not spread too thin trying to do it all at once. So that's kind of brief description of my role there. But let's get into kind of what we're here for. Learning about online streaming and the wonderful, amazing, and not so forgiving world of online audio. How does it differ from live? What are the things that change? What are the things that make a difference? What are the things that you can use for both? How do you implement both, mixing live in the room versus online for phones and TVs and cars and headphones, right? Hopefully I can kind of shed a light on how to maximize what you have, or with small purchases, be able to immensely improve your situation. So, let's dive in. So, let me ask you this. Show of hands, let's be honest. How many of you guys know what an EQ is and have a really good understanding of what an EQ does? Raise your hand. Okay. About half, cool. What about compressor? Also about half, okay. What about a gate? All right, and maybe the most fun, what about a reverb? All right, so about half across the board, it looked like from up here anyway, okay? So the thing that I think I want to touch on or dive into with each of these is, I think, when you're mixing, or you're trying to figure out how to mix, you're trying to figure out how to get your sound to sound better online, the first place you go to is YouTube. And there's some amazing resources out there, Churchfront being one of them. They have some amazing instructional videos on how to do anything and everything that is, live stream encompassing. However, the one thing that I always kind of see is, not that Churchfront is guilty or anything, but there's a lot of people out there online that are saying, you should do this, you should do this, you should do this. You should put an EQ first, and then a compressor, and then a de-esser, and then a gate. You should gain stage like this. But there's not too much explanation of why, right? Why do you EQ first? Why do you use a compressor this certain way? Why do you set the attack of a compressor short or long, okay? Why do you route pre-fader from a bus or post-fader? There's a little bit more, it's a little bit more aggressive of you should do it this way, but not a lot of explanation of why. So hopefully I can kind of fill that void the best I can. So let's start at the beginning. Gain, okay? What is gain and how does it affect, as Adam so eloquently said, it affects everything after in the chain. Okay, so what is gain? Well, if we really get down to basics, the signal coming into the console is coming from a mic, usually, right? And a mic is a little teeny speaker, okay? A little teeny speaker, anywhere from a size of a quarter to a size of a dime, okay? It's just wired backwards, okay? So the microphone typically works the very same way that a speaker does, just opposite, okay? So if you think physics, right? A microphone is taking acoustic energy, or it's taking a high and low pressure off of an acoustic waveform that's traveling through the air and hitting that membrane of that microphone, which is moving that membrane, okay? That movement generates a very teeny small amount of electricity, okay? Because it's an electromagnet. So when it moves in, it creates a very small positive energy. When it pulls out, it creates a very small negative energy, okay? So that's sent down the mic cable into our console. Because that signal is completely reliant on the small energy of an acoustic waveform, it's a very small amount of power. So the first thing it has to hit is a preamp that you'll find in the back of a console or on a stage box, okay? And a preamp takes that signal, and with a gain knob, you turn it up, okay? So you're increasing the positive and negative voltage, okay? The reason why we do that is because right off a microphone, that signal is far too weak to run through EQ, to run through a digital converter, which converts it to ones and zeros so it can go through plugins and everything that digital mixer has, okay? So the first thing it hits is the preamp, and that's your gain. That's what turns it up. So why this is important? Because that's what sets the gain for the rest of the chain, okay? And a movement there will affect everything after the fact, okay? So once it's gained up, now we can have a lot of fun with it. Now we can apply effects, we can EQ, we can compress, we can do a bunch of different stuff, or a bunch of different things that we need to do to make it sound good, all right? Now, that leads into the processing, right? EQ, compression, or time-based effects.
Hey, it's Jake. Before we continue with Jesse's amazing talk, I wanted to invite you to our next Churchfront Live Gathering. Link down below in the description of this video. And if we are running a discount on registration, you'll see a discount code below this video as well. Churchfront Live Gatherings are an amazing way to experience live training from experts like Jesse. And at these events, we cover a wide variety of worship ministry topics. Theology, technology, leading a team, musicianship, getting your ministry organized. And not only will you get to experience these trainings in person, you'll also get an opportunity to network with both my team, the guest experts who are coming to the event, and also other like-minded worship leaders who are going to be at the gathering. So click the link down below to learn more and register today.
Looking especially in DAWs, but digital consoles also, it can be extremely daunting. at looking at all the different plugin options. You have 1,000 different EQs. You have 1,000 different compressors. You have 1,000 different gates. You have, Waves makes 100 different compressors, right? What's the difference? How do I know what to use? Which one's good? Which one's not? What do I use on vocals versus bass versus drums versus any other track that I'm recording? Now, don't let that bog you down. Audio processing units boil down to 3 main categories, okay? You have dynamics bass, which basically means that processor is altering the volume or gain of the signal in some way, shape, or form, okay? So it's purely relying on the amplitude or the gain of it or altering it, okay? You have EQ, which is adjusting the frequency content, okay? If you really want to get deep, that is also a form of gain. It's just a frequency-dependent gain, okay? Everything EQ, everything that handles or deals with an EQ, all it's doing is altering frequency, okay? So all those thousands of EQ plugins, they're all the same, okay? They're all EQs. And then lastly is time-based, okay? And that is you are copying the signal and playing it back against what just happened, okay? So reverb delay, you're taking that signal, you're copying it, you're delaying it by a little bit, and then playing it back after you just heard the original, okay? So it's playing with time, it's changing the playback time of that signal. So all effects, reverb, delay, flanger, phaser, they're all playing with timing, okay? So all the millions and billions of plugins out there, whether it's on a console, whether it's in a DAW, all fall into these 3 categories, okay? So it's a really good way to kind of simplify all the options out there. Now, what I want to kind of do is say, okay, you can buy a console for $1,700 or $250,000, right? That has all that stuff built in. You can buy a DAW for, minus the computer, $500, or a full-blown DAW Pro Tools rig for 25 grand, okay? Whatever you do, whether it's a cheap option or an expensive option, they all have these 3 audio units in it, or those 3 categories, and they all do it similar, if not the same way, okay? So, is there one that's better than the other? Well, one could argue yes, but I'm here to tell you that you're really paying for options, okay? You're not all that much paying for quality per se. Now, the thing that's also important to understand is a digital console is a DAW built into a console, okay? So what makes this different than this? The box that it's in, okay? This is just a computer in here. It's just a computer running the plugins, the EQs, and the compressors, on this console, plus some tactical faders and knobs instead of a mouse, okay? This is doing the same thing, all right? So they are the same internally. They're very similar. They're doing the same thing. They're taking analog signal, converting it to ones and zeros, and altering it in some way, shape, or form based on those 3 categories, okay? Now, let's kind of a good overview of what these things are actually doing, okay? Let's dive into EQ. How do we use EQ? Why is EQ so important? Why, as Adam said, why do you cut lows from vocals or lows from acoustic guitar or lows kind of from everything but bass and kick? Why do you do that? Why do you boost the highs on things? Why do you seek and destroy? I like that. I've never heard that, Adam. You seek it, you find it, you spike it, you find that frequency, and you kill it. How do you know what frequency to find? Why do you do that? Well, the best way I like to speak in metaphors, right? So how I look at mixing in general and EQ. EQ is probably one of the most important processes of audio. Out of those three categories, EQ is priority for me. That's number one. And the reason why it's so important is when you have audio coming in on multiple channels, okay, let's say you sold up the kick drum. Cool. The only thing you're hearing is the kick drum, okay? So it's easy to make it sound heard. It's easy to make it sound present. It's easy to make it have thump. It's easy to make it have attack, right? All those things are fairly easy to achieve because that's the only thing you're hearing, okay? But as soon as you start injecting more sound in with the kick, all of a sudden all that detail can kind of go away. Why is that? What happens there? Well, think of back to the physics side of things, right? Microphone captures a sound wave, translates it into electrical energy. Well, a speaker does the same thing, but opposite. It takes electrical signal and turns it back into acoustic. Now, physically, a speaker can only move in one direction at one time, right? It can only be moving forward or backwards, okay? And there's no in between. The only in between is a travel. It's traveling. It has to be moving. So how do you take two signals? Let's say you have a kick drum and bass. How does a speaker able to play both of those signals at the same time if that speaker can only move in one direction at one time? Okay? It's basically what's happening is it's combining those two waveforms and playing the difference. Okay? So if you were to look at, can we go to the Ableton? Let's see my Ableton chops here. I remember how to zoom. Okay, so if we were to look at, let's say this is keys, and I were to zoom way in, okay, we have two different waveforms here, okay? Now, each of these waveforms are moving differently. Now, what does it mean when if you can see there's a zero line right here? Okay, so when the speaker, or when the signal is moving above the zero line, it's essentially the speaker movement. That speaker is pushing out. You're literally looking at the movement of the speaker when you're looking at this waveform. Okay, now, so when it's generating one signal, it's fairly easy for that speaker to do, okay? Because that speaker can only move one place at a time. Now, what happens when you add a second waveform? So let's say we had a low-end waveform. The low-end waveforms are very long, right? So you have this low waveform. What happens when I add a high frequency to it that's moving like this, very fast and not big and long? So what happens if I add the low end plus the high end? Basically, it does this. The high end is moving as the low end is also moving. So it takes those two waveforms and combines them and plays the difference, okay? Which is all fine and dandy if all you're combining is a low frequency and a high frequency. But what happens if you combine a low frequency with another low frequency, right? You have a big long waveform plus another big long waveform right on top of each other. How does the speaker do that? Well, it doesn't very well. Okay? It doesn't work very well. So, essentially, this is where we get into phase. Okay? And phase is where you have two waveforms that are combining. Either they're moving together or they're moving opposite. Okay? In general, we want them to move together because that's how the speaker is able to continue moving. If they're moving opposite, so if you have one waveform going up while the other's going down, the speaker just cancels out. It stops moving. It plays the difference. It kind of just fights itself. Okay? That's called phase cancellation. And when that happens, you lose signal. You lose power that the speaker is not moving very efficiently or at all. All right? So you can see these keys, these waveforms are moving relatively similar. They're moving up and down together. Now, this is the same source, okay? What happens when we have a kick? that's moving up and down, but the bass is moving down and up. Well, now when you combine those together, soloed, they're going to sound amazing. When you combine them together now, all of a sudden, where'd my low end go? Now I don't hear low end in the kick or the bass. Well, because they're fighting each other. Those signals are moving opposite of each other. So that's where that little phase button on a console, the 0 with a cross through it, really comes in handy. If you flip the phase, it's basically taking on whatever channel you're on and flipping everything that's going above the 0 line, it flops it, inverts it, so now it's going negative. So now you can flip one or the other, it doesn't even matter which one, and now they'll move together. You'll get a much more fuller, more solid sound. All right, full circle. How does that play into EQ? Well, this is just, again, we've only added 2 signals together. We've added kick and bass. Well, what about acoustic? What about electric? What about percussion? What about that low synth? Vocals, everything else that's in the mix, okay? Now we're taking what was a simple setup, 1 or 2 sources, and now we have 30 sources, all combining together and trying to be played out of one speaker that can move at one direction at one time. How does that work? Well, you end up with a very complex waveform that's playing the difference of all these signals playing back together. So inherently, there will always be phase problems, right? Because there's no way that you can combine 30 signals, 30 different waveforms together and have them play back perfectly, right? Have that waveform be perfectly represented by the speaker, unless you had 40 different speakers, okay? All playing a different source. So, EQ is a roundabout way of managing phase coherency between all your channels, okay? You're focusing frequencies for the different sources so that the speaker can do the best job it can possibly do at actually being able to somewhat coherently play back a waveform of 30 signals combined together, if that makes sense. Okay? So, how does that work? Well, let's take kick and bass again. Okay? That's a common problem with a lot of mixing, right? Kick sounds amazing together. Or kick sounds amazing by itself. Bass sounds amazing by itself. When I combine them, all of a sudden, they don't sound so amazing. They don't complement each other well. Well, that's where maybe you end up cutting some lows out of the kick to allow for the low end of the bass to take priority of that speaker. Okay? So the phase is still happening. The phase cancellation is still happening. You're just minimizing it between those 2 channels, right? By EQ. You're pulling low end out of the kick so that the low end of the bass can speak a little bit better. Now, soloed, it sounds thin. It sounds a little papery. It sounds a little smacky, a little metally, as Adam said, right? And it's not as gratifying. You're listening and like, that kick is kind of trash. Like, I'm not proud of this sound. But with the bass, all of a sudden, the puzzles connect. The puzzle pieces connect, right? Now, this happens across the board through the whole spectrum, from low end to low mids to highs. It's most noticeable in the low to low mid area. So that's where you're going to be finding yourself fighting to make room for all the channels, okay? Does that make sense so far? Any questions? Are you guys falling asleep yet? Okay. So that's, a thing to kind of think about. Wrap your head around using EQ to create a clean sounding mix, okay? And you can use any EQ to do this. You can use your car stereo that has treble, mids, bass. It can be as simple as that. You can essentially help yourself create a better mix. If you only had one EQ per channel with treble, mids, and lows, you can get pretty far with a good sounding mix, okay? And it's the simplest EQ known to man, all right? So when you have all these plugins with all these options and all these bands, and I have an EQ with 20 bands, my goodness. If you're notching that much out of a signal, maybe you should think about re-recording it or getting it better at the source, okay? But simplify it. Simplify what it's actually doing, okay? All you're doing is adjusting frequency, okay? So that leads into my second point about EQ. There's two ways to EQ a track. There is the sonic identity of a track, okay? So you're EQing to make it sound a certain way. I want this vocal to be brighter. I want this guitar to be bitier. Fill in the blank, fill in the adjective, right? How do you want this track to sound? I want this bass to be thumpier or grittier or, whatever, right? You're trying to achieve the sonic identity for that track, okay? That is valid. What is more valid is using the EQ the second way, which is how am I making this track fit in the mix? Okay? That is a more important way to think about EQ than to think about how do I want this track to sound, okay? Think about, the priority you should think about, how is this fitting in the mix? Then when I get it fit in the mix decently, then it's like, okay, now how do I want the identity to be? How do I want this track to sound in my mix, okay? But that's secondary. And I think a lot of people get tripped up they think that's priority. And then they end up gratifyingly EQing all the tracks the way they want the individual tracks to sound, but they've put little to no attention on how those tracks sound together. Okay, nobody hears stuff soloed. Nobody cares about how it sounds soloed. They do care about how it sounds together. All right? All right, let me pull up EQ. I have one here. Oop, went away. All right. So when we look at EQ, we look at the frequency range. Okay, so off to your left of an EQ is your low frequencies, and then to your right is your high frequencies, right? Pretty common. Everybody knows that. Now, to continue further on making room for tracks in a mix, okay? The problem with sound is all these instruments cover a wide range of frequency, right? Your bass can hit all the way down to the lowest humans can hear, which is 20 hertz, all the way up to, it can excite stuff all the way up to 15K, okay? Which is 3/4 of the auditory spectrum that humans can hear, okay? So a lot of people think, oh, bass is the bass. It's only the bass. No, bass is a wide range of frequency, okay? We hear the low end the most out of it, but it is exciting frequencies in that upper range, okay? Now, why this is important is as Adam said, you have to prioritize, you have to manage your frequency content for each track, okay? So where do I need the bass to be in the mix? Well, I need the bass to be the low end of the mix, okay? So it might be something that you're focusing the EQ so that the bass sits more in that low end area and doesn't sit in that top end, okay? But maybe you want it. Maybe you want some grit, all right? This is merely for me making a point. Acoustic guitar, for instance, all right? Acoustic guitar, when people hear acoustic guitar in a mix, and there's a lot of other stuff going on, they only really care about the stringy, right? I like to think of acoustic guitar as a tuned shaker, okay? I don't need a bunch of body. I don't need a bunch of low end unless it's the only thing in the mix, okay? Unless it's acoustic vocal only, then I need all that content down there because it's playing the role of the rest of the band that isn't there, okay? But if I'm trying to smash it in with 30 other tracks, I need to thin that thing out because all I really need from it is the tune shaker. I need the bright, stringy that has a pitch, okay? So I'm going to pull out a lot of that low end so that it doesn't clobber the bass, it doesn't clobber the low end of the vocals, it doesn't clobber the low end of the electric guitar, so on and so forth, okay? Electric guitar, same sort of deal, especially overdriven electric guitar. When you start chunking on electric guitar, there's a lot of low end that can happen with that. A lot of low end, a really subby, meaty thickness. That's going to destroy the low mids of your mix, or it's going to just clobber everything down in that range. So it's important. It's a good idea to kind of roll that stuff out or cut it out or notch it out. Now, don't take this as like, oh, well, that's easy. The bass needs to be low, so I'm going to low pass all my high end and only make that low. Acoustic, I'm going to make only high. Okay, you have to be tasteful with it because you do want some low end in the acoustic, for instance, or it's going to sound way too stringy, too brittle. Okay, but put some thought into it. Now, this leads me to my second thing, leads me to a thing. I've said second like 3 times. Okay, so on an EQ, we have our gain per band. So in general, it's a really good idea to cut most of the time, okay? Because every track typically has too much content, too much frequency content, okay? So if I'm boosting, if I'm saying, oh, I don't hear the low end in my bass. I want more, I want to feel it, Intuitively, you're going, oh, well, boost low end, right? I want to add low end. Or a kick, I want that to punch. I want to feel it in my chest a little bit, so you boost low end. Okay, well, what you're really doing is you're just adding to the problem. Okay? And you'll get into what I call as volume wars with yourself, where you're going, you get a mix, your faders are all kind of in the middle, and you're going, I want more thump in my kick. So you boost low end on your kick, and then you're going, well, I don't really hear the bass guitar anymore, so I want to hear more of that. So you boost low end of the bass guitar. Like, well, now I don't really hear vocals, so I'll turn those up. But now I don't really hear guitar, I'll turn those up. But now I don't really hear acoustic. You know what, that tambo track, that's really important in this chorus. I don't hear it, turn it up. Before I know it, your faders are all the way up, and you're left with the same mix. Okay, you've just essentially had a volume battle with yourself, and now your board's clipping, your mix is probably worse, and you didn't get anywhere. Okay, so that's where cutting is really powerful, okay? Think to yourself, what does this track need less of, rather than thinking, what does this track need more of, okay? You can essentially achieve the same thing thinking oppositely, okay? So if you're like, I want this track to be brighter. No, this track has too much low end. So I'm going to cut low end, and I've just essentially made it brighter, but by cutting low end and removing issues out of my mix, problem frequencies, right? Cool, so that's EQ in a nutshell. It's easier said than done, though, okay? I'm not insensitive to that. I've been mixing since I was 19, so it's kind of all I know how to do. If the world ended, I'd be worthless. But I can EQ a kick drum. But it is something that is achievable, and it is something that takes practice. It takes ear training, right? The more you do it, the better you get. I'm sorry to say, but there is just no quick fix, okay? It's just like learning a keyboard. It's like, I can learn how to play a song, Mary Had a Little Lamb. That doesn't mean I can play Fair Elise or whatever amazing piano song you can name, right? It takes practice. You get good at it, right? The more you do it, the better you get. So I implore you to practice mixing. Do a mix. And church is an amazing location to practice, okay? Here's how you practice. Take your mix home and listen to it in your car, on your earbuds, on your phone, on your laptop, on your home stereo, on your TV. Take it home and review. It's really revealing how bad your mix is, okay? And it doesn't go away. Okay, I have some of the worst days. I'll take a mix home and be like, man, I just ruined the low end of this mix. It just wasn't there. Didn't get it. And the next week, it's amazing. All right, what did I do? How can I repeat that? Right? And the only way I'm doing that is taking it home and reviewing. When you're mixing in a single space, whether that's a studio, whether that's a live room, you're kind of blinded on how your mix sounds. You know how it sounds in this room, but you don't know how it sounds anywhere else. And take your favorite song, your favorite sounding song, you play it on your phone, sounds pretty good. Play it on your earphones, sounds pretty good. Play it on your laptop, sounds pretty good. How do they do that? Well, they took it and listened to it on all those devices and made subtle tweaks and tried to find a happy medium between all of them. You can't focus a mix on a specific area and expect it to sound amazing on the other, but you can find a good happy medium between all the sources, or all the destinations, rather. Okay? So take your mixes home, practice, review, be honest with yourself. Still to this day, every weekend, I take what I mix in the service and I listen in the car. Now, I'm not saying you have to listen to the whole thing again in your car or wherever else, but just put an ear on it. Okay, things will pop out immediately. You go, the bass, the kick isn't quite right. The hi-hat's a little too hot. I don't like the high end of these vocals. The verb's too loud. You just notice these things right away. And you take little mental notes of going, okay, next week I'm going to tweak that. Next week I'm going to bring this down. Okay? Over time, you do this for a year or 2 years, I promise you, your mix will be a lot better than when you started, just by listening to it at home. Don't only rely on the location that you're mixing to judge your mix. Okay? All right. Everybody good? Yep. Yeah, really good question. I'd say about 85% aggressive. Okay? So what that means, it's a really good question. Basically saying, when do you address these issues if you hear them, right? If you're in the middle of a service, do you take time and do you potentially reveal a problem in the middle of a service to address this issue? Yes. Yes. Within reason and tastefully, okay? You can get away with a lot of little sneaky things that nobody will notice, but will make the mix better while the service is going on. Now, if you're making broad stroke adjustments, those should be taken care of before you get to that point, right, in rehearsal. So if you're, I like to think of it as like, I like to do all my coarse tweaking, my heavy lifting stuff, my heavy EQing, I'm rolling a bunch of stuff off, I'm roughing it in, essentially, during rehearsal, okay? And then during the service, and even the first couple songs, usually the first couple songs don't sound as good as the last because I've been tweaking the whole service, right? But that's just kind of the nature of the beast. Hopefully that it's not that drastic of a change. Hopefully the drastic changes have happened in rehearsal and you're only fine-tuning during the actual service. But yeah, don't feel like you can't touch once service starts. Yeah. Yep. Really good question. When a mixing is a very active thing, okay? Don't assume that it's like, set it and forget it, and it will be this blanket perfection across every band that ever walks on stage. It's not. It will never be. Bands change, instruments change, drums, the sound of drums, tone changes. everything changes, which alters how those frequencies are sitting with each other, how those EQs are interacting. One bass player might dig in a little hard. One bass player might have a bit more aggression on his pickups, right? One bass player might be really round and smooth and reggae sounding. Okay, so that EQ that I'm using for one is just not applicable for the other. Now, hopefully, in the church world, that's kind of the blessing, right? A lot of situations, it's kind of the same setup or relatively the same. Okay, so when you're making fine-tune adjustments over a few years, in general, that band has, the drum set has relatively stayed the same. The players are relatively the same. And when you start working with a few different players, you start to learn their tone. You know that this guitar player has a real bright, Fender-y sound, where this guy has a warm Gibson, kind of maybe muddy sound, right? And you just know it ahead of time. So you generally you know what EQ you're going to be doing before you even walk up to it, okay? But it takes playing with musicians and learning their style and learning their tone. Cool, so let's talk about gain structure. We kind of skipped to EQ, which is very important. Gain structure is also really important. And then I'll touch on mix structure. What are we looking at time? We good? Okay. All right, so gain structure. What is gain structure? Or gain staging, a lot of people call it. You're managing the overall level of every track and the level of all these tracks combined, okay? I like to think of it as traffic. Some like to think of it as water, okay? Water flowing through pipes, or traffic flowing through roads, okay? So in Denver, we have our traffic grid, if you will, we have streets running north and south, and we have streets running east and west, okay? So the streets running north or south, we have Kipling, we have Wadsworth, we have Federal, we have Sheridan, Colorado, Bellevue. We have a bunch of streets running north and south. Think of those as your individual channels, okay? Kick drum, Sheridan. Snare drum, Federal, right? All your individual channels going north and south on the city grid. Let's hypothetically say that all the traffic was coming from the north and going south, okay? So they're all one ways going north to south. And my gain knob is the traffic cop at the top, all the way up north going, all right, you guys can go. Stop. You guys stop. You guys can go. Stop. Okay? He's allowing traffic down the road. Okay? That's your gain knob. You're allowing that signal to flow down. All right. So along the way of these north and south roads could be Chick-fil-A. We'll call Chick-fil-A our EQ. Okay? So our traffic stops and goes through the drive-through lane at Chick-fil-A. And because Chick-fil-A is Christian chicken, can I get an amen? They handle crowds amazingly, better than any place, better than churches most of the time, okay? So they're just real efficiently getting the traffic right back out on the road, right back heading south, okay? That's your EQ, okay? Your signal got interrupted, went through an EQ, and then continued through the channel, okay? Now, all these roads are going north to south. There's traffic flowing. All right, then we have our big interstate, and our big interstate's running east to west, okay? All these north to south roads get on to the interstate, okay? Because they're going to Kansas. They're going out east, whatever it is for you guys, okay? So everybody's traveling to Kansas. So they start going north to south. They go through Chick-fil-A, get some meal, get some EQ, get on I-70 to head to Kansas, okay? Now, I-70 is a bigger road, right? It's 2 to 3 to 4 lanes sometimes. It can handle some traffic, but it can't handle too much traffic, okay? So if all these traffic cops on the north side of town are letting too much traffic in, if you're only allowing one north to south road onto I-70, yeah, there's all the room in the world for that, right? I-70 will never get jammed up. But what happens if you let 30 north and south roads at full capacity, all the traffic onto I-70? What happens? Traffic jam, okay? And traffic stops, so we get a red. Red means clipping, okay? We got a traffic jam. We have too much signal hitting the master bus, okay? Or I-70, all right? So we have individual channels. I-70 is our master bus. That's our main fader going out to the speakers, okay? So I-70 has a limit, just like the individual tracks do. When we're setting our gain, we're getting healthy level, but we're not letting it clip, okay? The gatekeeper of those north and south roads is the fader, okay? Now, big misconception with faders. A lot of people think faders turn things up, right? It's like, oh, turn that up, turn that up. Hey, bring that fader up, turn it up. No, a fader is a faucet. It's allowing stuff to pass through or not, okay? So a lot of people call it an attenuator because that's what it's actually doing. It's not gaining anything up. It's allowing it to pass through, okay? So the gain knob is what's getting the gain. That goes into the fader that you have down, okay? And that's the traffic cop going like, nope, can't go through here, stop, okay? When you bring that fader up, it's saying, all right, a little bit can go through. Not everybody, just one car at a time, guys, all right? When you bring that fader up to 0, that is the traffic cop stepping out of the way and all the traffic can go through, okay? So that fader is doing nothing, okay? It's not stopping anybody. It's just allowing that signal straight through as much as that gain knob is set to, okay? So when you're doing a mix and you have all these individual channels feeding your mix and all of a sudden you notice your main bus is clipping, a lot of people think, oh, we'll bring the fader to the main bus down. Wrong. Why that's wrong is because all you're doing is there's a traffic cop at the end of I-70 going, stop, all right, you can go through, you can go through, you can go through. Ideally, you don't want a traffic cop. You want him to step out of the way, right? So your master fader you want to set to 0, and it just lets this traffic through as long as you've managed the traffic, okay? So if you're clipping your master bus, the fix is not bring the master fader down. The fix is bring all your individual channels down relatively so you're not feeding as much into your master fader or I-70, all right? Make sense? Kind of a stretch, I know. Okay, that's gain staging. Okay, so from the beginning of where the signal starts, from the microphone or microphones all the way out through the master bus out to your speakers, hopefully you have good gain stage. Okay, now this really plays an important role because when we start talking about EQing, remember how at the beginning I said that EQ is just gain, right? It's frequency-dependent gain. Okay, so if I took an EQ, flip to the Ableton real quick. If I took an EQ and boosted everything, all right, and let's make these cues a little broader. Okay, so I did that with my EQ. I essentially just turned the fader up, right? Because the curve of my EQ, the relationships of the frequencies for that individual channel are relatively the same. They're just all louder, okay? So when I see EQs and, you know, I look at a lot of EQs sometimes and it's like, it looks something like this. And they've done a good job of cutting, not boosting, which is awesome. Keep doing that. But in general, their EQ is like down here. It's like, okay, all you've done is you turn your fader down, right? Where a more effective and healthier thing to do with a signal is, all right, let's maybe keep this curve and just bring it more back up to the center line. So the EQ is doing as little as possible, but still essentially changing the frequency relationship, if that makes sense. Okay? So how that relates to gain is, well, this is essentially a form of a gain knob. So if your mix is all clipping and you go to try to boost something because you want more low end, you don't have any room to. It's already, you already have a traffic jam on I-70, so now you're trying to inject more traffic by boosting something on a track, and you're not getting anywhere. All you're doing is just clipping your master fader more. Okay? So if we do a good job of managing that traffic or managing our gain staging, then we have lots of headroom. We have plenty of room on I-70 to fit more cars if we need to. Okay? It allows your mix to, it allows you options to fix your mix, to EQ, and to do the things you need to do to make that mix happen. If you have no headroom, you just don't have those options. Those options go away. Okay? All right. Lastly, what time am I supposed to end? Sorry, I don't know. Okay. I think that inadvertent means you're already past your time. All right, so let's talk about what mixing is. Okay, what does it mean when you do a mix? And how, what are you actually altering? What are you changing? How do you make something sound good? Like, what are you doing when you're mixing? Okay? Are you just moving faders and EQ to do something? It's like, no. To me, mixing is a pretty visual thing for me, okay? There's a lot of colors involved, and there's placement, okay? To me, mixing is like painting a picture. You're drawing a picture with sound, okay? Now, bear with me here. Let's say my stage from this side to this side is my stereo field. Typically, you're mixing out of two speakers, your left and your right, okay? Now, I have EQ, I have volume, okay? I have this other thing called a panner, which allows me to pan between left and right, or left and right for you guys, okay? So, how do I use these things? Where do I place things in my mix? Why do I place things in my mix, okay? Now, live, it's important, a little bit less important, because a lot of rooms are built mono, so where it's just point source, so they have all the speakers are just playing the same signal. So you don't even have stereo, okay? So in that case, that kind of goes away. But in broadcast, all TVs, unless you have like an old school click, click, click TV, okay? That's mono, but all TVs, most phones now are stereo, headphones are stereo, laptops are stereo. They all your destinations are stereo. So it's very important to think about your stereo field. Now, this is where you get into the creative part of mixing. This is the fun part of mixing. This is why I love it. And this is like the dessert of the job, okay? So, how do you structure your mix? How do you place things? Well, I like to think of mixing as a three-dimensional box, okay? So think of it's a box. You have front, you have back, you have left, you have right, and you have everywhere in between, okay? So when I'm panning, let's say I'm not using any effects yet, any time-based effects, okay? When I'm panning, my stereo field is very one-dimensional, okay? I can go left to right and anywhere in between, but I haven't gotten into back and forward yet, okay? So with no effects, my mix sounds very two-dimensional. So I can, hey, I'm lead guitar. I'm going to stand right here, okay? So if I'm listening right in the middle of the two stereo, or the two speakers, it sounds like I'm coming from right here. Not fully out of that speaker, not out of that speaker, but more on this end, okay? I've panned it about 45 degrees, Okay? If I pan it all the way over to the left, now I'm right, only coming out of this speaker. Okay? So I can essentially place instruments anywhere along this line. I can say, all right, I'm the tambourine guy. This is me. Shaky, shaky, shaky. Okay? I'm electric too, holding down the rhythm. Just bar chords for days. Okay? I'm the lead singer. Look at me and my tight jeans. Okay? I'm the background singer. I'm just backing up this dude who's kind of full of himself. I'm the third guy who's probably not even in the mix. Okay? I'm the lead guitar player who's almost has as big as ego as frontman over here, but not quite as much. And I don't know. I don't know. Who am I? Bass. Ooh, that's a hard one. I don't want my bass on the left side only, but I like where your head's at. That's like a 1950s move. Okay? So anyway, you can place any of these instruments. Now, what's important to understand with this is symmetry. Okay? It's very important to have a symmetrical placement of your instruments. So if I have a lead guitar player over here, okay, I don't want my rhythm guitar player here, okay, because now my mix sounds left-heavy guitar. So now I have this like ball of guitar on the left side that's, kind of distracting, right? What would be better is if I had lead here, rhythm guy here. Now it's like, ooh, cool, I see this guy over here and hear this guy over here, and you can even match it with where they are on stage a little bit, okay? I also don't want to have my lead singer over here. Hey, guys, look at my tight jeans and my hair. Cool, but then the people over there don't really hear lead vocals all that well, okay? So I don't want to have my lead singer over here. I want the lead singer to be right in the middle, okay? So you want to achieve symmetry. Now, you have some sources that are mono and some sources that are stereo. What do you do with those? Okay, mono sources, never downplay the importance of a mono source, okay? I prefer a mono source over stereo. Sorry, keyboard players, sorry, stereo guitar players, okay? Because I can really very specifically place them where I want. Okay, I can with stereo, but now with stereo sources, so let's say keys have a left and right output. I have two sources, okay? It's not just a mono that it can pan one way or the other. Now I have two, so I have to decide what to do with these two sources. Now, the default is, just pan them wide. The left side of this piano goes over here, or right for you guys, and right goes over here, okay? Usually that's good. Not all the time, though, okay? The thing with that, though, is if you listen to the piano in stereo, it is a very monocentric sound, meaning it doesn't sound like it's wide. It sounds like the majority of the sound is still right in the middle, even though I've panned them wide, okay? So keep that in mind. Stereo guitar players, same exact thing. The only thing that's stereo is your effects. Your guitar is mono, okay? So even if you're going through your amazing Big Sky Verb, okay, that does sound amazing, that's the only thing that is stereo. But what it does, if I take your signal at the board and pan it wide, well, now I just plopped you right on top of the lead vocalist. And your effects are wide, but now you're clobbering the lead vocalist, okay? So I haven't done a very good job of placing you. And I'm fighting trying to make the lead vocal and the lead guitar work together better with EQ, where sometimes it's just like, hey, put them over here. Now you don't have to EQ as much. You've created space for the lead vocal and the electric guitar, but that also means collapsing your effects a little bit, okay? This is why I like, sorry, I keep pointing you, I don't know why. You probably don't even play guitar. This is why I like mono guitar, because I can just place them and I'm not sacrificing. I'm not taking his beautiful wide effects and smashing them down to one side or the other. Now, this is a two-dimensional space, right? I haven't added any effects. So, I've created a really good two-dimensional mix. But how do you get into the world of depth in your mix? Okay, when you listen to a really good record, close your eyes. You listen on headphones or whatever, it sounds vivid. You hear, oh, that little part's coming from over here. Oh, there's that weird guitar that sounds like it's in a basement way down there somewhere, right? Oh, that weird vocal guy is way in the corner. Lead vocal's like right up front, but he sounds huge, okay? They've achieved a three-dimensional space in their mix, okay? This is where the box comes in. How do you do that? How do you create that space? Well, hypothetically, let's say you've done a really good job of managing your EQ, okay? So there's room frequency-wise for every channel. You've done a really good job of placement, panning, and you've done a really good job of gain staging, so you have plenty of headroom to play in, okay? Let's say hypothetically those are all taken care of. How do I get my lead vocal or my third background, that's probably out of the mix anyway, okay? How do I get them to be heard but not overpowering anything else? But still I can hear all the detail in what he's doing, okay? Well, EQ is a big one. You've made room for him, so now I can bring him way down, but I still hear exactly what he's doing, okay? But also effects. So, simply put, lead vocals right up front and center. Third harmony guy, I want him in the back. More verb. All of a sudden, he does this in the mix. Okay? He comes way back. And if you get a lot of verb, and now you're starting to deal with like 10-second decay verb. All right? Hey, guys. Okay? Throw a big, huge, wet verb on something and turn it way down. It sounds like it's coming from back here. Okay? And also, by doing that, I've just defined the boundaries of my three-dimensional space, right? So now my space sounds this deep because I have something back here that sounds this far back, all right? Now I can place anything by the amount of verb and the length of verb in this stereo field, both with panning and effects, right? So now I have a lot of space to play with. Now when I'm having trouble getting every track heard because the frequencies are fighting a little bit, now I have another tool to separate them, to keep them away from each other, okay? And I've achieved a very vivid sounding mix, okay? Now, again, this takes practice. A lot of listening in your car, listening on headphones, getting a good set of studio monitors can help this, okay? But don't depend on that too much because that can give you a lot of false hope. And there you go. Now, if you really want to get deep into it, you can also kind of achieve height, okay, in your mix. So now you have left and right with panning. You have depth with effects. Verb mostly, but delay too. Sometimes what's kind of fun with delay, if you want to make it sound like there's a big fat wall right here, take your lead guitar player or a guitar player, maybe the noodle guy that's doing all the noodling. Not quite a lead, but not quite a rhythm, just kind of noodling, right? Pan them over here, hard left, and then put a quick slappy delay over here. It sounds like there's a wall right here now, even though he's over there. It sounds like it's coming out of his amp and smacking this wall. Okay? So it just created a space in my mix that's out of the way of the vocals, right? I'm over here. The vocal's still doing his thing right down the middle, clean and clear. This isn't even messing with them, but now it sounds like it almost makes it wider sounding than just panning left to right. All right. So that's what that's one thing to really kind of think about. Think of your mix. Get out of the gear a little bit. Okay. A lot of people get caught up. It's like, oh, what's the right EQ? What's the right compressor? What's the right whatever? Should I use, the stock EQ? Should I use this fancy Waves EQ? I don't know. Okay. Do I need this cool new plugin? No, probably not. Okay. Think of it as you're painting a picture. You're arranging the sound in your stereo field to be presented well. All right? And there's a whole bunch of art in all of that. All right? All the way down to just the kick. All the way down to the snare. How do I get that snare to just be gushy and tsh, but also have clarity and have, and be heard and not be muddied up by everything. Okay, that's effects, EQ, they all play into each other. All right? Start using the solo button less. Don't use that solo button. The only time you should use a solo button is if there's a problem. If you're like, man, there's a buzz coming from somewhere. Nope. Bass. Always the bass player. Okay? Other than that, when you're mixing, you can use a solo a little bit, but not too much. Never forget how it sounds together. Okay? Get out of that habit. It makes a big difference. It forces you to kind of live with the tracks together and how they're influencing each other, how they're playing off of each other. All right. Everybody good? Okay. I wanted to touch on vocal tuning. I think you had a question earlier on how do you switch keys, okay? And also, just quick pros and cons of both using digital console versus DAW for live streaming. Auto-tune. So, in the digital console world, if you're using auto-tune, you have to be using it with an external, like sound grid, wave sound grid, or literally running it through a computer and back to get that auto-tune plugin. So how do you switch keys without going vocal 1, D minor, vocal 2, D minor, vocal 3, D minor, right? How do you just switch them all? Okay? Because the last thing you want to be doing is, it's the first verse. He's in B flat, and that ruined the song. Okay? In Waves sound grid, if you're using a digital console, you basically have to set up snapshots to do that. So you are, whatever your session is saved as, you save that, then you isolate, isolate all the plugins except for the tuning plugin, which means when I do a snapshot or a scene change, all the plugins that are isolated don't change. The only ones that actually change are the tuning plugin. So then you create a snapshot for C, C sharp, D, E flat, so on and so forth, all the way up. And then, so that's one way. But the problem with that is you can't really do song-to-song scene changes, right? Because you're only using the snapshots to change key, okay? In the DAW world, you're setting up automation lanes. I had tacos, I'm sorry. So, same sort of deal on the vocal track in the DAW. Now, this also kind of leads into the other thing. When you're using a DAW to mix, I highly recommend not using it to record as well. Okay? You want to have a separate system to record. For various reasons. Reliability being a big one, this being another one. Okay? So if you're not using it to record, you're just passing audio through it, then you're setting up automation lanes. So I've set up automation lanes on my vocal tracks for C, C sharp, D, right? All the way up the scale. So then I'm just clicking markers anytime the key changes, and it switches all the tuning plugins. Okay? But with that, the transport's never moving. Where if you're recording, you can't do that. Okay, I can't move my transport because it's just rolling. Okay, that's really the only way that I figured out how you can change keys, both in live console and in DAW. Now, quick pros and cons about console versus DAW. Okay, console. Consoles are more reliable. I'm sorry if you're a DAW fan, it's just the way it is. They are far more reliable than DAWs. DAWs are just notorious for crashing. Okay, now you can, just workflow-wise, you can do stuff that really minimize that, but ultimately they are computers, they are programs running on computers which crash. Okay? So they're more reliable. Not to say they don't ever not function, but most of the time you turn them on, they're working. Okay? You don't have to worry about authorization. You don't have to worry about, did it connect to the internet to find my account so it authorizes this software, like a DAW, okay? So they're more reliable. They're a little bit more straightforward. They're more tactile. It's like, this is coming in here. It's going to this channel. So they're a little bit easier to look at sometimes, where a DAW is open source. You can arrange anything any way you want, which can make them fun if you know what you're doing in them, but also really daunting if you don't, because it's a clean slate. Cons with digital consoles is they're limited, okay? The people at Behringer or Midas or Yamaha or SSL or Digico, right? They are doing their best to try to accommodate the needs of a live environment, right? So that when they design these, they go, all right, they're going to need outputs, they're going to need auxes, they're going to need EQs, they're going to need compressors, they're going to need whatever, okay? The problem is they're never going to think of everything, because a lot of times things come up that's specific to your location, to your band member, to whatever, right? So they can be a little bit limiting. You'll find sometimes they're like, oh, I wish I could do this. I wish I could do this. So you just can't, okay? But I will say they get a lot right, okay? For the most part, you can do a lot with a digital console nowadays. Now, just if you're somewhat new to it, think 15, 20 years ago where digital consoles were relatively new. You had consoles that were nice live consoles, and you had a gain knob, and you had an EQ, and you had a fader. And that's all you got, and a panner. Okay? If you wanted fancy de-essing or compression, you had to get a rack and buy a compressor or a de-esser or a gate, put it in this rack, but you only got one. Use it wisely. Do I put it on the kick? Do I put it on the snare? I don't know, but choose one. It's not like a plug-in where you can be like, I want it on every single channel. Okay? So 20 years later, now we have a console that's $1,700 that has all of it on every channel. That's amazing. 20 years ago, this console and an analog console would have cost $150,000. The functionality of this, what this can do, okay? Which is a lot. You can do a lot with this, okay? DAW, but it is limited within that, especially when you get a broadcast mix. Like Adam said, you can't do drum replacement. Tuning is hard. You need a separate device that runs with it to do the tuning. So there's some limitations. Reverb and effects can be limiting in here unless you buy a separate unit that does a better job at it. But again, you have to buy a separate unit, okay? DAWs, highly functional, okay? They're open, as far as like routing schemes, so yeah, they're open source. You can route anything to anything times 100. Okay, where these are limited, you only have so many buses, you only have so many auxes, EQs, so on and so forth. So, reliability, that's kind of what you're paying for, all right? You're losing a little bit of function, but you're gaining a lot of reliability, okay? DAWs, you're gaining function, but you're losing a little bit of reliability. Now, I use a DAW. I used to use a Yamaha CL5 for broadcast. It was a great console. It could do a lot of stuff. It couldn't do a lot of stuff also. So, I found myself going, man, I wish I could do this. I wish I could do this too many times, right? Now, the cool thing is a Yamaha CL5, I think it retails for like 30 grand, okay? Pretty expensive console. Now, in the grand scheme of like big live sound applications, that's really actually relatively cheap when you're talking about 100 grand plus digital consoles, right? But still pretty expensive. We sold it. I bought a whole Pro Tools rig, a full-blown Pro Tools rig, not just on a laptop, for 25 grand. So I actually we made 5 grand just by getting rid of that console. And now we have an amazing DAW. Okay? So, DAWs are generally going to be cheaper up front, but be ready to be a plug-in expert, plug-in authorization expert, and a bit of a computer tech, okay? Because it comes with inherent issues with that sort of stuff, authorizing plugins and software in general, okay? Now, the other thing is they can maximize reliability with a DAW is keep the machine clean, okay? Most computer issues are because of the user, okay? Most of the time when someone goes, my computer's slow, it's like, well, maybe you shouldn't have 40 tabs open on Safari at the same time that you're live streaming, right? Keep it clean. Use it for one thing if you can. Now, a lot of times you're using it for multiple things, and I get that. But even within that, don't use it as your personal computer too. Don't be using it for email and saving your pictures and saving your videos and all that kind of stuff. All you're doing is clogging the thing up. Okay? I like to think of a computer as a big file cabinet, right? And imagine you had a file cabinet and someone that's OCD that organized it, and everything's in perfect folders, nicely labeled. Anybody could open that thing up and be like, oh, I know exactly where camping 2018 pictures are, because they're right there. It's labeled. And then you have a worship leader over here with his file cabinet, and he just throws it in. And it's like, there's a whole stack of stuff in here, documents, pictures. Well, who knows what they're just full. If you talk about efficiency, if I was tasked with, hey, can you grab that one document from one of these, which one do you think I'm going to find it faster in? Computers are the exact same way. Keep them clean. Keep the file structures clean. Label your folders. Label your files. Keep them nicely and organized. Be able to open your computer and know exactly where a file is every single time, okay? That's going to keep that machine running clean and efficiently. It's going to allow programs like Ableton, Pro Tools, Logic, Studio One. It's going to allow them to run better, faster, quicker, more reliably. All right? So you can do things to keep the reliability up on the DAW because God knows they need it. All right? Cool. Any questions? Yeah, so sound check. Now, sound checks can widely vary depending on the church and the rehearsal time period that you guys have. At Red Rocks, rehearsals, so let's say we have a service at 9, typically rehearsals start at 7 on the dot. So everybody's there earlier, so they're ready, downbeats at 7, okay? Sound check, we go through a quick line check, which is just, hey, kick, snare, toms, really more to make sure I got the signal, less to make sure it sounds good, okay? There is, you're constantly tweaking as you go, and if there's an issue, then it's like, hold up, keep playing that snare, that type of thing, right? But the idea isn't like a full sound check where you're starting from 0 and building a whole mix. Hopefully, at this point, your mix is relatively dialed in, right? Like I said, church is amazing in the fact that it's somewhat consistent from week to week. So you can really kind of fine tune your mixes as you go. So you're not having to do, it's not like a show downtown that you see where there's 5 acts. And it's like, they got 15 minutes to clear the stage, get the band up, and get them sounding decent, which is never really a thing. Because they only have 15 minutes to start from scratch. With church, you have weeks with the relatively same instruments, same drum set at least, which is a huge part of it, right? So, you shouldn't really, if you're having to start your mix over from scratch, which sometimes is good to do, I would do it on a separate day, if you can. Don't do it before Sunday, because that's just a lot of stress. So it's just a line check that we do, and then they run through all the songs, and it's really more for the worship team to get their parts down, more than it is for me to get. Now, within that, I'm tweaking as I go, but yeah, and then we'll do just like transition stuff. So if, we're going from bumper video into the first song, out of the first song into a video, we'll rough rehearse those, and then we're ready for service. Yeah, totally. Anybody else? No such thing. Yeah. Yep. So, I'll tell you a quick story. Well, first of all, always have a plan B. Okay? If you're using a DAW to do your broadcast mix, hopefully it works most of the time. Okay? If it does fail, have a backup plan. Have a copy of the front of house console's mix ready to patch. Okay? Or just know in your head, hey, if this fails, I need to patch my mix into the front of house mix into the stream as quickly as possible. Okay? While I either get my DAW back up and running, or just bail on it altogether, and that's going to be our mix. At least people can hear something. It's better than silence. Now, story behind that, I didn't do my due diligence one day, and I didn't have a backup plan. And I was using Pro Tools, and this was, so usually we do our live broadcast on Thursday, which isn't really a live, it's a captured. So if that were to happen, it doesn't even matter, because I'm multi-tracking it, and I'll just fix that spot if it failed. But this, we were doing a live worship night, and it was live to Facebook, and YouTube, and all the handles, right? So rehearsal goes well, band sounding good, I'm stoked about it, I'm stoked on how things are coming through and sounding. We start, we're live. Halfway through the first song, a little window comes up on my computer, and it's like, cannot find authorization for Pro Tools. Please check your account to resolve the issue. We'll give you 5 minutes to save and close. Halfway through the first song. And this is like a 10-song worship night, live to Facebook. And what makes matters worse is we put a TV up on the front row with like scrolling comments so the worship leaders can like follow along and sing it, right? Yeah. So you know where this is going. So I either had to wait 5 minutes so it can quit for me, or just quit and log in, try to get iLock and authorization. So I did. I was down for 8 minutes, which seems like eternity in that situation. Got it authorized. No, I couldn't get it authorized, so I had a demo version of Pro Tools, like a 30-day demo version authorization in my account. So I used that to get it back up and running. Got it up and running 8 minutes later, and, of course, as they're going in that 8 minutes, like, can't hear anything. People are going, well, check your internet connection. I'm going, sorry, guys. So it does happen. The real issue with that is I didn't set in place a backup plan, right? Where what I should have done, if I were thinking a little more clearly, or if I kind of planned it ahead of time, I should have gone into Dante, patched the main mix out of our front of house console into the live stream, at least until I got it running, and then switched it back. But, in those moments, you don't think too clearly. That's why it's important to kind of plan those things, or at least have a plan in the back of your head. Run through the motions of doing that switch, so when it comes, it's not so like deer in the headlights, I don't know what to do right now. Okay? So yes, it will fail. Just like if a console crashes, you'll lose everything. All right? But that's the reliability of a digital console that you're paying for. They're a little bit more reliable. Now, however, that, knock on wood, I've been mixing in a DAW for a year and a half every weekend. And that's the only issue, that's the only fail that's happened. And it wasn't even a crash, it was an authorization. Basically, Pro Tools, you have a choice with Pro Tools. You can authorize through the cloud or through a dongle iLok key. And I, for some reason, chose the cloud. So it would periodically check online in my account for authorization while I'm using Pro Tools. And you see it happen, and even hindsight's 20/20, but periodically through that year, you'd see it pop up, like, checking authorization. And I'm going like, that's going to bite me one day. Sure enough, it did. So I've since moved it onto a dongle, which is physically plugged in the computer. So it doesn't need internet connection. It's not relying on signing into your account, nothing like that. It's just there. Okay? But it hasn't actually crashed. It hasn't actually, like, CPU overload down. Leads me to the last thing, because I think I'm probably done now. I feel like, okay. The other thing about mixing, and why I really push to stay away from the big fancy plugins, right? Big fancy plugins look impressive. They can do a lot of cool things, but I'm convinced that they're really just kind of unnecessary for live broadcasts anyway. And the reason is two reasons. A, they're pulling you away from the fundamental principle of mixing, right? Use your ears, make room with the frequencies, okay? And any parametric EQ can do that, okay? And two, they're using system resources unnecessarily, right? So if you pull up a big fancy Waves 10-band EQ, that may be using 5% of your CPU, just that one instance, okay? Whereas a stock plugin is using like 0.25% of your CPU, and you're generally achieving the same thing, okay? And like I said earlier, if you're reaching for that 10th band on an EQ, maybe you should move a mic, get a better sound from the source, okay? Now, with that being said, it does happen. You got to do what you got to do. You got to carve things the way you got to carve them. I get that, okay? But keep it simple. Keep your mix simple. Keep it set up simple. My mix at Red Rocks is a relatively simple mix. There's not crazy fancy routing. I'm doing drums with some additive stuff, additive compression stuff. That's the fanciest thing I have as far as routing scheme. I'm using 2 reverbs, 2 in the whole mix, and a delay. Okay? I'm not using 10 different reverbs. I'm using 2. Okay? So keep it efficient, keep it clean. It's going to make your mix cleaner. Okay? Verb, that's a big thing. Effects, a lot of people think, I need this big fancy verbs. I need 10 of them because every instrument requires a different verbs. Like, no. If you set it up like an old school analog desk where you had one reverb unit, okay, you'd use an aux and you controlled how much verb was on a track by how much you're sending into the verb on each individual tracks. But you're only using one verb. You're not putting a verb on every single channel. Set your DAW up like that. Use an aux, feed a verb, that's your verb. Okay, so I have a short and a long verb for my whole mix. Everything you hear online, 2 verbs and a delay. All right, keep it clean, keep it simple. Use stock plugins. Okay, they're powerful. They're really powerful, and they're really efficient with CPU. Okay, so part of the reliability that I have with my DAW is I have a CPU meter that I'm constantly looking at, and if that goes above 25%, I've failed. Okay, don't get up to 40, 50, 60%. Okay, because theoretically you're going, oh, I still have 40% left. I'm good to go. No. One spike will crash your system. You're too close. 60%, I like to think, is more like 90% or 95% on a computer. Because if that CPU gets spiked all of a sudden, or if, it's checking the network status and it requires some CPU usage outside of your DAW, boom, you just spiked it, crash. Okay? If you keep it to 20%, you're usually pretty good. I've been really solid with that, knock on wood. Okay? By using stock plugins, keeping my mix simple, just doing a good job managing frequencies, gain staging, and a good use of effects. All right? Cool. Yeah, I know. Well, so I'm really glad you picked up on that. I was going to say something. As we all know, I've told speakers till I'm blue in the face, hey, so when you're holding the mic down here, nobody can hear you. And when you're coming to me and going like, hey, so I feel like I'm really quiet in the house. Can you turn me up? Yeah, do this. So walking up here, and I don't speak publicly really ever, so I'm like, all right, I got to practice what I preach and hold this mic right here. So, yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. Cool. Any questions or anything? Yeah. So, CPU, the CPU of a computer is the brain. It's what's doing the processing for any task that the computer's doing. So in the DAW situation, every plugin that you add, every EQ, reverb, it's relying on the computer's brain to crunch those numbers, to do that work, to create the sound that you're altering, right? So the CPU monitor is showing you how much capacity is left in that brain. So it's basically saying, like, you're using 10% of what this brain can do right now. No, CPU. So it's the processor in the computer. It's Pro Tools. I'm sorry. It's Pro Tools. Has its own CPU meter within Pro Tools. Yeah. Yeah, the DAW itself usually has some sort of CPU readout. And then if it doesn't, you can look at like Activity Monitor, which is built into a Mac just to kind of always view your CPU. If that meter isn't built into the DAW, but most have them built in. So you can always monitor. Yeah. Yeah? Yes. Yes. Okay. So gain staging, right? Take us back to that. So we're back to I-70. Okay. We're at our mix fader. Let's say we've done a really good job of gain staging. So if you've done a good job, the meter of your master out, we'll just look on Ableton right here. This guy, I don't know if you can see it, this meter right here. So just like any other track, like Adam said, you're shooting for 3/4 of the way up or around the yellow. As on the individual channels as well as your master fader, okay? So the idea is on the loudest, biggest choruses of the loudest sound, if I'm right here under clipping, but a healthy level, okay? That's a really good spot to be in. That's what we call mix level, okay? That's where your mix should be. In the studio world, we call that mix level, okay? Now, if you put that right out onto the stream, it's going to seem quiet, okay? Because mix level is not mastered yet, okay? So one of the big things that mastering does is bring the level up. Now, in the digital world, you can't go above clipping. No matter what program you're using, no matter what device you're using, clipping on one thing is clipping on everything, okay? There's no like secret software I'm using that allows me to get louder without clipping, okay? Clipping is clipping across the board. So if I'm clipping on this meter here, I'm clipping everywhere, or everywhere after this is getting a clip signal. So how do I get it louder online? Mastering, okay? So mastering, what does mastering do? In the recording world, when you're doing an album, similar process. You take all these individual channels, you record them down, you perfect them. At some point, you do a mix, a studio mix, though, right? You're taking all the individual channels, and you're bouncing it down to a stereo mix. You're taking that meter and recording it, so now you just have a stereo file, okay? You send that for every song to the mastering engineer, okay? So the mastering engineer doesn't have all the individual files. He can't turn up the kick drum. He can't turn the vocals down. All he has is that stereo file, okay? So what a mastering engineer's job, to put it simply, is he can EQ and compress the stereo signal. That's all he can do, all right? So how does he get it louder? Well, when you're mastering something, you're basically fooling the ear into thinking that it's louder, okay? You're changing what we call the perceived loudness, okay? So how do they do that? Well, your ears are a very human sensor, okay? They're very imperfect. They change depending on mood, depending on tiredness, depending on altitude, okay? And they're not very clinical at all, okay? They're probably the opposite of clinical, okay? They're moody. Your ears are very moody, and they hear stuff in a very average level, okay? So they're not hearing like a meter views. So when you see a meter hit and spike, your ears don't hear that way. They didn't hear that spike. They heard that. The meter went like that. The audio actually went up to here. It was loud for a second. But your ears only heard this. Okay? The reason they do that is for protection. They're protecting themselves. Okay? They don't want to hear that full level because you'll destroy your hearing. All the mechanisms in there, you'll hurt it, or you'll lower the life of them. Okay? So they have all these built-in protections to limit that sound, right? So mastering engineers play into that. Okay, so they hear a more average level, which means they kind of round out those peaks as you're hearing them. So when I have a mix that's at mixed level, basically what a mastering engineer does is he puts a limiter on that mix. Okay, and what a limiter does, it's a compressor. All limiter is a compressor that has a threshold, and he sets the threshold just below clipping, okay? And I mean just below clipping. So if this, I don't know if I can't make this bigger, I think. Oop, there we go. Yeah. Okay, so if this is clipping right here, well, it's hard to see. Let's say the very top of this meter is clipping. Mastering engineer will set a limiter like there. So it's just under clipping, okay? To get technical, it's like anywhere as small as 0.1 dB below clipping, okay? Now, what a limiter does is it says, okay, here's my threshold. I'm a device that turns things up, down mostly, okay? So when audio comes up and hits my threshold, I'm going to temporarily turn it down so it stays below my threshold, okay? So I'm constantly counteracting the audio that's trying to go above my threshold. And a limiter is just that. That threshold is hard. It does not let anything through. So it turns it down, whatever it has to do to keep it below that threshold. So a mastering engineer takes your mix that's healthy but not close to clipping, and it turns it up into that limiter. So the more it turns it up, the more that limiter has to work to keep it below the threshold. But technically, I'm never clipping. I'm never going above clipping, okay? Perception, though, it's starting to sound louder because my ears hear average level. They don't hear they don't hear the clipping, or they don't hear the peak value, okay? They hear average, so I'm essentially changing my average value. I'm increasing my average value, even though I'm not going above clipping, all right? So on the meter, it never clips, but all of a sudden my meter is just like pegged. It just looks like it's solid, okay? And it sounds louder to us. So that's what's happening. That's what should happen for your stream, okay? Because think about this. iPhones, earbuds, TVs, you name it. The devices we use to hear content on are designed to listen to mastered material, okay? Because anything you purchase, back in the day, albums, CDs, anything you purchase, Spotify or whatever else, all that content is, for the most part, mastered, okay? Some aren't. Some protest against it, but 99% of stuff is mastered. So all these devices are designed to play back stuff at mastered level audio. So they respond and they perform better when they're being delivered mastered audio. Okay, so at the end of my chain, before it hits streaming, I'm not just leaving it at mixed level. All right, because it'll still sound good. You'll just find that it's quiet, okay? And on the phone, that you can only turn up so far, it's not far enough usually, okay? Where if it's mastered or limited up, it just works a lot better. The other thing, to get really technical with it, is just like video that goes to YouTube, it gets data compressed. Right? So what you're seeing on your screen right off the camera, you have nice, rich, deep blacks, right? Your darks are really dark. Your light, the contrast is really nice. You stream it to YouTube, all of a sudden, like, oh my gosh, I see all this grain and pixelation happening in the darks, okay? It's because that video is being data compressed, being squashed, so that they can quickly and efficiently stream it to whoever needs it with questionable internet connection. Right? Audio does the same thing. They do the exact same thing to audio. And how do you counter that on camera? You light it up really well, right? You light things up really well, which hides that pixelation from happening. It still happens, it's just hidden a little bit better, okay? Audio is the same way. When I get nice hot level, that encoding that happens, or that data compression that happens, is still happening, but it's hidden a little bit better. Where if I have really low level audio, there's not that much content for those very destructive encoding processes that are happening to grab. So it just does a worse job. It's accentuating the issue. Okay, so that's why it's really important to master. I know I haven't touched a lot on that, but after you do all the mixing, master that audio. Get it nice and hot. And even if, don't smash it, you're not just like destroying your mix, but even just a little bit of compression, 2 or 3 dB, if it's that limiter's hitting about that much, it'll go a lot further on the streaming world. It'll sound a lot better. It'll be fuller. It'll feel better on a phone. When you turn it up, it'll come up to where generally what you're used to it coming up to with streaming services. Great question, though. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
Dude, that was awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
A big thanks to Jess for speaking at our last Churchfront Live gathering. I want to invite you to register today for our upcoming gathering. I'm going to put the link down below at thechurchfrontlive.com. That's where you can learn more about the event. And make sure you look at the description below this video if you want to take advantage of any discount codes we have available for registration. If there's a discount code available, you will see it next to the link. If there isn't one, then you'll just have to wait for next time. If you found this video helpful, hit the thumbs up button, share it with your friends in worship ministry. I can't wait to hear how this training helps you improve the way you mix for your worship ministry. Thanks for watching. See you next time.